Hi, welcome back to Coding Games in Python. In this video, we'll talk about animated time sprites, and in particular, we'll talk about how to create explosions. So let me kind of show you what we like to be able to do in this video. So let's run this. Okay, if I click on any place, it's going to create an explosion. Yep, so we want to create this sprite explosion. Okay, great. Let's go here. Alright, let's go back to the lecture. So, we talked about in the previous video common types of sprites in games. Simplest one is a facing sprite, one that faces left and right. We actually did this in the last video. So in this video, we'll talk about time sprite, which is where images or textures of a sprite is drawn in order at a specified time interval. So for example, we could draw the images or textures of a sprite every 5 frames or every frame. And so the explosion sprite that we see just now is an example of a time sprite. We just played all the images out at a certain amount of by a certain specified time interval, and then it plays it out, and then at the end of it just remove itself. And then in the next video, we'll talk about walking sprite, where we can simulate a character walking across the screen. Okay, let's kind of again, just a reminder here from the previous video. In the sprite class, we have a texture, which is the current texture that we need to, that we can that will be drawn, and then textures is the list of all the textures or images that we can choose from for our sprite. And then the set texture will set the current texture to be whatever index we want from the textures list. Okay, let's look at the code. By the way, this explosion sprite example is basically from the examples on the arcade website, documentation website, and this is a great resource. So this place you should visit often to look at a lot of examples. And okay, so let's kind of look at how we can code this. I'm gonna first let's look at the explosion sprite. So typically when we create a sprite, we need a file name, the name of the image, and a scaling. But in this case, we'll have a lot of images. In fact, if I look at the images folder here, I have over 200 images that if I play them throughout, it will simulate a very realistic explosion. So that's a lot of images. So our constructor would be very simple. It's going to just take a list of all those images. And so let's kind of go back to the main file here. So this all these files are generated from the explosiongenerator.com. And so you can go there if you want to generate more explosions. As I mentioned, there's about 270 images, and so we want to we'll kind of look at how to load only some of them, because I think that this is actually a lot of images to load for an explosion. But that's basically where we get those images. Okay, so we'll come back to that. Let's go back to this again. And so assuming that we have a list of images that's been loaded from here, we can, you know what, let's actually, I think it's probably easier to go back over here and do this one first actually. So let's do this first. We're gonna create a explosion list. So this will be a sprite list. This is a list of all the explosion sprites. And then I'm going to create an explosion texture list. So this will be the list of images or textures that we're going to have. And so initially this will be just an empty list. Okay, so let's talk about how to load these textures. Okay, so I'm going to do for loop. Again, this is a lot of images. So I'm going to just pick the 40 and somewhere in the middle. I mean, it doesn't really matter. You pick any 40, any 30 you want, and it will look pretty good. And so I'm gonna pick the 40 from 40 to 79 here. And okay, so let's figure out how to come up with this string. So I'm gonna use so this is the texture name. And I'll use an F string here. So the name is gonna be well, first of all, it's gonna be from images, explosion. These are the directory, and then we'll start out with explosion, and then this is where we have the F string, and we want I to be here because I is the index here. So I is going to go from 0 all the way up to 270, but we need to do some formatting. So the colon is specified that we're going to do some formatting, and I want the width to be 4 because I want notice these numbers have 4 numbers, so the width to be 4, but I want to have padding on the left with 0. So if I have a small number, I would pad it with zeros. So this is an F string. Okay, so this is the width, and I also want .png. So this will give me as I cycle through the for loop, this will give me all these names, images. Okay, and then so now I need to create the actual texture. So rk.load texture, and I will send over the texture's name that we just created. So this will create the texture object from the image, and then I'm gonna basically add this to my explosion texture list. Append texture. So this will take out all these images, create texture object out of it, and then load it into this textures list. And so okay, so here's why do we do this? The reason why we do this here in the init method of the game window is because if I were to do this here in the explosion init, then every time I create a new explosion, it will load all these images, and it will be very slow. So we want to load it only once and create a global variable for it, and then use this variable to create every subsequent explosion. So that way we don't have to reload every time. So that's why we do it here. But if we have a smaller list, we could have done it over at the init here. Okay, and this list is actually the list that we're going to send over when we create from this constructor, from this parameter list. This is the same texture list. So let's now write the explosion sprite. So I need to initialize. So because my init here, I'm going to call the init of the sprite class, and I have no file name, no images yet. I need to initialize my images. So I need to initialize my textures. So again, this is the attribute from the sprite class. This is the list of all the texture for this sprite, and this will come from texture list, the one that we have from the other we just created earlier. So set that be equal to texture list, and then I now need to also initialize the current texture. So I want to I actually want to create a texture index, because we need to cycle through all these textures. So let's start with 0, and then I need to initialize my I'm going to set the texture to be at that position. Okay, so the initial index is 0. So now I'm initializing the texture variable to be the first image from that list. Again, we could have also done this another way. We could have done this by saying texture is equal to self.texture bracket 0. This is the same thing as doing this right here. Okay, so we initialize the textures, the list of all textures, and also the current texture, so that when we first draw the explosion, it will be the first image from this list. Okay, so now this is the update frame. Technically, this is not moving really. There's no change x, change y, but just for good practice, I'm just going to call the update from the parent class. And then, so this is very simple. I'm just going to take the texture index and add 1 to it. So again, the update is gonna cycle through all the textures and then just display them one by one every frame. So I'm gonna add 1 to my index. Then if adding 1 doesn't is still less than the length of, so I will need to make sure that my index is still less than the length of my textures list, right? So this is the list of all textures. If I'm adding 1 and my index is still less than the length, that means I'm still in the valid range. Then I can set my texture to be equal to the one at position given by the index. So this is a valid index. Set my current texture to be that texture. Otherwise, in other words, but suppose that adding 1 will give me out of bounds, or give me to the end of the list. Well, that's the case, then I'm done with my explosion. I can just kill it from all sprite lists. By the way, remember from the sprite list video, this will remove the explosion sprite from all lists, all sprite lists. So so that's basically the basic logic for my explosion sprite. So over here, I'm gonna now go to the so I have my sprite list, explosion list. So I need to draw it. So explosion. So all my explosion will be here. So I'm gonna draw all of them, and then I also need to update all of them. So explosion list dot update, and then this will basically call the update. All right, from this will call this update for every explosion that I created. Okay, so now where do I create the explosion? Well, when I press a key, I have access to XY of the mouse press. So I'll create an explosion, a temporary explosion, and I need to send over the explosion texture list that we created. This is the list of all images that we had earlier, and then I need to position my explosion. So center X to be at the X position of the mouse, and then the center Y to be at the Y position of the mouse. And then I need to take my explosion list. This is my sprite list, and then add this explosion to that list. So that's it. This will create the explosion, add it to my explosion list of sprite, and then it will draw it and then update it. And when it updates, what does it do? It just basically cycle through all the images and then display them one by one. And so that's how let's run this, make sure that this will work. Yep, there it is. By the way, the first one is kind of laggy, and then after that is fast. Okay, I want to say one last thing here, is that so this is cycling and drawing every texture, every frame. But if that's too fast, maybe that's too fast for you, we can also could have done this a little bit slower by doing this, something like this. Maybe, so again, this is if I were to create a frame count or something, start at 0, and maybe I want to do something like if frame count modulo 5 is 0. So maybe I want to every 5 frame to cycle through the next texture rather than every frame. So it depends on how fast you want to cycle through that. So that's why this is called a time sprite, because we can choose how fast we are displaying these textures. Okay, great. That's all I want to say in this video. In the next video, we'll talk about how to do a walking sprite. Okay, thanks for watching.